Welcome to the deep dive. We take the sources you give us, articles, research, historical notes, and pull out the key insights, basically giving you the shortcut to getting up to speed. Today, we're looking at something really fascinating, a history from Brazil that's way more complex than you might think. It's based on this material called Brazil's Forgotten Cannabis Roots, Smoke and Empire. And our mission here isn't just to talk about, a plant. We're digging into a social history, a racial one, a political one, all defined by these completely opposing views of the very same substance. It's a conflict that started, almost 500 years ago?
That's exactly right. And understanding that conflict, that dual history, is key to figuring out why Brazil's current situation with cannabis regulation is such a mess. It really all goes back to the 16th century. The plant essentially arrived twice, you see, at the same time, but through different rates and crucially with different names. And that naming difference, well, it pretty much set the stage for centuries of social control that we still see echoes of today.
Okay, hold on. Let's unpack that a bit more slowly, because this history includes something pretty major. You're saying the sources point to the first ever cannabis ban globally happening in colonial Rio.
That's what the historical records suggest, yes. A specific ban in Rio de Janeiro's municipal code.
Wow. Okay, so we definitely need to understand the context for that. Let's start with the two arrivals you mentioned. The Portuguese ships, 16th century onwards. They brought seeds, right? Specifically, Cânhamo.
Yes, Cânhamo. That's the Portuguese word for hemp. And it wasn't just brought along, it was strategically important.
How so?
Well, think about the Portuguese Empire. It relied on its navy. Cânhamo was absolutely essential for making strong ropes, durable sails, all the rigging. It was a vital naval commodity.
So growing Cânhamo wasn't just farming, it was like state policy, supporting the empire's infrastructure.
Precisely. It was statecraft. Colonial governors actively encouraged its cultivation. It was seen purely as an economic strategic asset.
Okay, that's one side. But you said there's another arrival, a completely different identity for the same plant.
Exactly. At roughly the same time, other seeds arrived, often carried secretly by enslaved Africans forced onto those same ships. This version wasn't called Cânhamo. It was known as Maconha.
Maconha. And for them, it wasn't about naval supplies at all.
Not in the slightest. For the enslaved people, Maconha was a piece of their culture they managed to bring with them. It was used in rituals for spiritual connection and as traditional medicine, a source of relief in horrific circumstances.
So right from the start, you have this stark contrast. The state sees a commodity, Cânhamo, while the enslaved population cherishes a cultural tool, Maconha. How long did it take for those views to collide?
Oh, pretty much immediately. By the 1770s, you see official directives pushing for more Cânhamo farms, state-sponsored stuff. But at the same time, the use of Maconha by Afro-Brazilians was already being demonized. It became associated with laziness, with resistance. It became taboo.
So this split, it really was along lines of power and race from the get-go. Cânhamo for the empire, Maconha for the enslaved.
Absolutely. One plant, two faces. And the opposition to Maconha wasn't really about the plant's effects in some objective sense.
It was about control then.
Completely. Plantation owners, the colonial elite, they hated anything that gave enslaved people a sense of autonomy or joy, or even just relief from their suffering. Maconha use represented a kind of internal freedom, a cultural space the masters couldn't easily control or stamp out.
That fear of losing control, you could feel it in the records. But interestingly, the sources show Maconha didn't just stay within the enslaved communities, did it? It spread.
No, it definitely didn't stay confined. Indigenous communities, for instance, they quickly recognized its properties. They started cultivating it, incorporating it into their own ceremonies. Sometimes they called it fumo de Angola, smoke of Angola, clearly linking it to its African origins. And there are references to things like the cachimbo da paz, the peace pipe, so it integrated pretty deeply into other cultural practices too.
Okay, that makes sense. But here's the part I find really surprising. The sources say it wasn't just the marginalized groups using it. It reached the elites too.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where the hypocrisy just leaps off the page. We have evidence, for example, that Queen Carlota, the wife of the Portuguese regent who fled Napoleon, used cannabis.
The queen? Yeah.
Yes. Reportedly, she brewed it as a tea to manage severe menstrual cramps. So you have royalty using it for medicinal relief.
Well, the system her husband represented was already moving towards condemning its use among the poor and enslaved.
Exactly. And it wasn't just royalty. Later on, especially in the cities, it became kind of fashionable among certain elites. Doctors and pharmacies actually marketed cannabis products. You had things like cigarros indios, Grimos Indian cigarettes prescribed for asthma, insomnia, nerves. all sorts of things.
So doctors were prescribing it?
And poets were writing about its creative spark, artists using it for inspiration. It was surprisingly integrated into various levels of society.
Right. So if it was being used by royalty, prescribed by doctors, celebrated by artists, how did the state manage to justify a ban that seemed so focused on just one group, the Afro-Brazilian population?
Well, that's the critical point, isn't it? The official disapproval, the laws that were coming. They were never really about the plant itself. They were about who was using it and how. When the elite used it, it was medicine or inspiration. When the enslaved or poor used it, especially communally, it was seen as dangerous, degenerate, a threat to order.
Which brings us to that 1830 ban in Rio, the Código de Posturas. What exactly did it ban?
It's incredibly specific. It didn't ban cannabis generally. It banned the pito do pango.
The Pito do Pango. What's that?
It was basically a term for a kind of rudimentary cannabis cigarette or joint, the way it was commonly smoked in Afro-Brazilian communities in the slave quarters.
So they weren't banning the plant, they were banning a specific cultural practice associated with Black Brazilians.
Precisely. It was targeted cultural policing, plain and simple, dressed up as public order.
And the penalties. The sources highlight a huge difference there too, right? Between sellers and users.
Oh, absolutely. The law was cleverly structured. If you were caught selling the pito de pango, you faced a fine 20 mil reais, a decent sum, but essentially a financial penalty, treating it like a disruption of commerce.
Okay, a fine for the seller. What about the person caught actually smoking it?
That's where the cruelty lies. The user, who was almost always an enslaved person, or maybe a poor free person of color, didn't face a fine. They faced 3 days in jail.
3 days in jail in a slave society. That meant what? Brutal forced labor? Beatings?
Almost certainly. Lashes, abuse, hard labor. The punishment wasn't financial, it was physical. It was about discipline and control, directed squarely at the black body.
So the structure protected the merchant, maybe even a white merchant profiting off it, but punished the black user physically.
Exactly. It reveals the intent perfectly. Drug policy, right from this very early stage, was fundamentally intertwined with policing black culture and maintaining the brutal hierarchies of slavery. Public health wasn't even really part of the discussion. It's chilling. And that model, that link between drug policy and racial control, it didn't end with slavery, did it? It seems to have intensified later in the 19th century.
It absolutely did, especially after abolition in 1888. Suddenly, the state had a large, newly freed black population, mostly migrating to cities like Rio, and the elite felt an urgent need to control them. That's when you see the rise of a real moral panic, heavily pushed by doctors, politicians, and the press.
How did that manifest?
Maconha was aggressively rebranded. It was blamed for everything: madness, crime, laziness, vagrancy. All the anxieties the white elite had about the black population were projected onto this plant.
And this is where the racism became explicit, kind of pseudoscientific. Extremely explicit. The term Africano itself started being used almost as a slur associated with Maconha use and criminality. Being marijuanado, basically, high on marijuana, became a public health warning, a sign of degeneracy. The sources are quite blunt, saying science was twisted into racism, policing culture under medical cover. You had physicians publishing studies claiming cannabis caused unique forms of mental illness, specifically in people of African descent. It was blatant medical racism.
And this whole moral panic, this racialized science, it paved the way for actual national laws in the 20th century, during the Vargas-era.
Yes, Brazil actually got involved in the international anti-drug movement quite early. The first big step was Decree 20.930 in 1932. That law formally classified cannabis alongside substances like opium, making it a matter of national security and public health, not just local policing.
So it elevated the threat level, legally speaking.
It did. And then came the final blow, really. Decree Law 891 in 1938. That one banned all private cultivation of cannabis.
And that's where the Cânhamo, the useful hemp, gets swept away too.
Exactly. The state essentially threw the baby out with the bathwater. The economically valuable Cânhamo, once vital for the empire, was legislated out of existence right alongside the culturally significant Maconha. By that point, the plant's identity was completely transformed. It was stripped of its history as a naval resource, stripped of its cultural roots, and reduced simply to, as one source puts it, a police word, a justification for arrest.
It's an incredible erasure. But despite all that, the ban, the racism, the laws, The cultural connection to Maconha didn't just disappear, did it?
No, it couldn't be completely stamped out. It went underground, of course. People kept growing it secretly, maybe in hidden gardens in the favelas. And its meaning persisted. It showed up coded in samba lyrics, shared among dock workers in Bahia and Rio. It remained this symbol, part medicine, part cultural touchstone, part quiet act of resistance against a system that had criminalized their traditions.
So we've traced this journey from essential imperial commodity to a racist tool for social control. It's a heavy history. How does it all connect to what's happening in Brazil now?
Well, that deep, conflicted history is precisely why the current situation is so gridlocked. You have this plant that literally helped build the empire's ships. And now the push for reform, for medical access, for decriminalization, it's largely coming from the descendants of the very communities targeted by those early laws. But the state itself, it's still caught in that old conflict.
How does that play out institutionally?
You've got basically three major forces pulling in different directions. First, there's the Supreme Court, the STF. They've recognized the failure and, frankly, the injustice of the old drug war approach. They're currently trying to shield people caught with small amounts for personal use from criminal prosecution, acknowledging the reality on the ground.
Okay, the court is moving towards decriminalization. But then you have Congress.
Right. Congress, which often reflects more conservative, traditionalist views, is actively trying to block the STF's moves. They're trying to pass legislation to recriminalize personal use, essentially doubling down on the old prohibitionist model.
Why is such strong resistance? Is it just politics?
It's partly politics, but it also taps into those deep-seated moral panics, those old ideas about Maconha disrupting social order. For many legislators, it's still viewed through that lens of control established back in 1830, not primarily as a health or economic issue. And then you have the third player, Anvisa, the National Health Surveillance Agency. They could create clear regulations for medical cannabis, maybe even industrial hemp. They have the authority.
But they're stalling.
They're incredibly slow, caught between the courts, Congress, public pressure, and probably internal disagreements. The result is paralysis.
So the court tries to move forward. Congress pushes back, the health agency hesitates.
And the outcome? No clear, functional legal market exists. Not for patients who need medical cannabis, not for farmers who could grow hemp, and definitely not for recreational use. Brazil's cannabis story, even today, feels like it's still stuck back at those colonial docks, defined by that fundamental conflict. The state recognizing potential value, but deeply distrusting the culture and the people historically associated with its use.
What a journey. From vital naval supply to a tool of racial policing, and now stuck in this regulatory limbo. It really underscores how drug policy is so rarely just about the substance itself.
It's almost always about who uses it and why, and how that intersects with power.
You've really walked us through the layers here. Thank you.
And that brings us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to mull over after this deep dive. Think about this. If Brazil really did establish the world's first cannabis ban, and that ban was explicitly designed to control enslaved people, how much of the global drug policy architecture that followed, even policies enacted much later in Western countries, might still carry the DNA of that colonial-era impulse for social control, rather than being purely based on modern public health science? It's a legacy worth examining closely.